Martin and I are just going to do 5 minutes just to introduce what we're doing around exploration, and then we're going to hand over to Waleed and Russell to take us through what they're doing at Saudi Aramco, which is really exciting stuff. So, okay. So in terms of, if we're looking at our oil and gas customers, a lot of you are in this room, so none of this will be a surprise to you, but one of the key challenges in the oil and gas industry is the ability to find those new reserves, and that gives them a competitive advantage in terms of getting to the right wells and getting that exploration and production up and running really quickly. So the management and reuse of that information is absolutely critical. Martin is going to take you through the value chain in a minute for those that aren't so close to the oil and gas industry, but in terms of managing that information, it's really critical, both from a business continuity standpoint, but also from an audit standpoint. So a lot of the time, you know, there's a lot of audit and compliance that forces these companies to make sure they know where that information is, and this could be going back a few years. So managing that information through the value chain is critical. Along with that, comes complex business processes, complex business decisions. So this isn't just about management of information, it's about management of processes and taking it through that whole cycle. So we'll touch on that today, and then the main core of the presentation will take you through how information is managed in more detail. So what have we been doing? Well, really the last sort of few years we've been working really closely with companies like Saudi Aramco, companies like Statoil, to really look at this upfront, the upstream, the exploration process. And we've been using Documentum D2 to build solutions around that space to manage this information. So again, going back in time, a lot of what we've done with capital projects, asset operations, supplier exchange, is rather than repeating this time and time again, we're looking at packaging a new solution for the exploration space. Okay. I think you've seen the slide a few times today, but this slide is the energy and engineering architecture, but specifically for oil and gas. So we've obviously still got capital projects and asset operations, supplier exchange that are relevant in this industry, but what we're doing up front here is focusing around the exploration and well file management and packaging that as a solution to fast-track customers to manage that information.
So what we've got on the screen here is a typical sort of process funnel really for an oil and gas company. So myself and Kirsty and the team here over the last 10, 15 years have worked with many oil and gas companies. We both spent years at BG Group. We've mentioned Statoil and Aramco, but probably worked with 20 or 30 different oil and gas companies. And this is a very consistent view that the companies, certainly the companies in the exploration stage, they sometimes call it a value assurance framework. They call it a value chain process, value assurance process, but it's basically a way of assessing the amount of activity that they're doing at a exploration stage through to actually producing oil. And so if you look on the left-hand side of this diagram, you'll see what we call really a sort of early stage basin analysis. This is where the sort of highly paid geophysics, geoscientist engineers will be looking around the world at the areas that they believe have got oil, doing analysis on them. And at certain points, they'll either decide that there's an area that's worth investigating, or probably more likely, a lease becomes available somewhere, let's say off the coast of Africa. And they will decide whether to actually bid on that lease. And they may have done some previous analysis work to say they think there's some oil there. So they'll take maybe hundreds of analysis opportunities, then start to narrow this down. They then they start to work on a particular lease. They will enter negotiations probably with the country around acquiring the rights to a certain area to explore. And then from really down here, we get into what we call prospect development. There'll be some further analysis of that area done, ultimately start to drill some exploration wells, appraise the discovery, and at this point, if they decide this is worth moving ahead with, then we start the capital project piece of putting in place let's say an offshore sort of drilling facility. So what's important about this is that there is a huge amount of very valuable data. I'll give you a couple of data points. One company that we spoke to has told us that in putting just a content management system in place to manage the information through this pipeline, and if they're able, through these are decision gates at the bottom here, and as they move through the process, they decide whether to continue with a particular opportunity. If this organization can make one better decision each year and make one less bad decision each year, then over a 5-year period, they believe that's worth about $150 million. Another example I had recently, a company in the US I was talking to about this, an international oil producer. We were talking about the problems they have in finding information once it's been produced in this process. And they said that they were looking at a lease negotiations with a particular country, and they'd done some analysis through a consulting company some time before, and the country asked them to reproduce the document that they'd given, and they couldn't find it in their system. They went back to the consulting company, and they were charged $100,000 to get that new document, which they paid instantly. And they said they had that document, the $100,000 document was in their system. It was just in a file system, they couldn't find it. And when we've been talking to these organizations, what we're seeing is each of these areas is just a silo. There isn't really a consistent way of, or hasn't been a consistent way of managing information across this sort of, this value chain. And that's meant that there's a lot of recreation of data, very difficult in finding old data. Another really good, interesting sort of data point we had was an organization that had an opportunity to buy a lease. I think it was off the coast of Africa. A lease came up and somebody said, you know, this is coming up at a pretty good price. Do we want to bid for it? Have we done any research before? Have we done any analysis in this basin? And they couldn't find any, but somebody said, I'm pretty sure we did. A few years ago, we had a student in who I believe did some analysis on this area. They couldn't find the document in their system because it was just in this big file system. Somebody knew the student, who was then, 5 years later, was in a job, was able to contact him, and he was able to send the document through to them. And the document said, yes, there is oil. And they actually bid on the lease, took the lease, and are producing oil. Now, how many times that they are unable to do that, they actually can't calculate because the information is just lost in the system. So this is really high value information. It's difficult to get, and it has a long history of silos. And so what we've looked at here, what the work we've been doing with Statoil and also with Aramco, has been looking at this value chain and putting together an information architecture and a way of managing the information that actually is consistent across that whole value chain, but obviously provides the specific functionality for each of those different user areas. It manages information through this sort of approval gate process as well. So we have this application running on the in the booth. You can go and have a look at that. So just to recap before we hand over to Aramco to talk about their particular application. So access and reuse of information across the value chain, really important, super high value. Audit and compliance regulations, are forcing companies to better manage this information anyway. So it's not just the cost or the upside of finding the data. The decision gate process, when we worked at BG Group years ago, the problem they had with their decision gate is that they'd have these super expensive guys from around the world getting together to discuss a particular decision who actually just had the wrong versions of documents that they were looking at. So, great, they could all get together but make the wrong decision. So just simple content management stuff. And this is a complex organization, multidisciplinary, and it's a sort of a complicated set of different departments, but ultimately, really, it's sort of content management 101. It's just about getting the right taxonomy, getting information under control, and allowing people to find that data. So what we've done is, I said, built this sort of standard starter point for this solution, which you can come and take a look at. We're currently going around talking to a lot of different oil companies. I'd like now to hand over to Waleed and to Russell, who have been working. Russell is from EMC, Waleed is from Aramco, and they've been working at Aramco to implement a system that I think manages probably the second half of that value chain, but I'll allow you guys come and explain that to us. So.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to present for you the managing disrupting change without disrupting operation. My name is Walid Qasqas, and I'm managing the enterprise content management within Saudi Aramco. And here with me, my colleague, Russell Roy. He's from EMC and been working with us as a consultant for like 3 years. First of all, I will go over I'll give you an overview and background of what we're going to be presenting. Today, we're going to be describing what is EPUR and the EPUR architecture, the planning, the EPUR roadmap, and the EPUR status and timeline. Russell, please.
So before we talk a little bit about, or have Walid talk about what EPUR vision is, I wanted to set things in context just a little bit. So as most of you know, Aramco is the biggest oil company in the world by quite a large margin. And the upstream area is the area that we're focused on. So it ties back into what Martin was just talking about in that, if I can figure out how to work this, in that the upstream process begins right at the exploration piece where oil is being discovered, or you're looking at resources and analyzing data to find prospects, all the way to the point where a decision has been made and oil's been discovered through the production well drilling process, finally to the well shutdown. So if you look at it, it's really a story of assets, that you're basically discovering these assets, you're managing and making decisions based on those assets all the way through, and assets that come into this side of the pipeline will survive, or some of them will, all the way through to the other end. And so the basis of the upstream system that we're talking about is starting in where Martin and Kirsty were talking about with the exploration, but it carries all the way through production and production drilling and through all of the different life cycle and gates of it. So the situation that led to the EPUR, EPUR initiative that Walid's getting ready to talk about is basically an artifact of the fact that technology has moved really quickly in the oil and gas industry. So new technologies have come along. An aggressive organization like Aramco, which is a large organization, has implemented a large number of systems that are basically siloed systems because they're taking advantage in different business units of new technologies that are available, and the result is a pretty predictable result. You get a lot of systems that are built up. They're all collecting their own data. They have some ties into back-end systems, some not. And the result is that you end up with a lot of technology and a lot of high-value systems, but there's a lot of data duplication. There's a lot of uneven data quality standards about how that data is in there. There's uneven security standards around what data is sensitive and which is not. There's conflicting information because there's redundant information that often is not correctly determined between the two. There's an inability to overall audit where decisions are being made and what information supported them because you're not sure if it was this system that did this or that system that did that or this piece of data that went into it. The data tends to be unavailable across business unit lines because oftentimes they aren't really sure of the connection that they have between the data. And then there's supportability issues because you have a large number of systems and it's unclear about what that data needs to have in it in order to be complete and have good quality. There's a lot of extra manual data steps that you shouldn't have to have. You should be able to have automatic feeds between these different systems that produce data, but in reality, people end up having to put it in manually. Leads to redundancy and errors between it. And you have your systems relying on key developers because you have a lot of systems, they're scattered across the business unit, so when someone moves on or they move to another organization, then you end up with real problems about maintaining those systems. So, all of this leads up to the EPUR initiative.
So the EPUR initiative, what is it? It's the Enterprise Production and Unstructured Repository within Aramco. It's an initiative that existed for 3 years now. Okay, the mission of EPUR is to replace the 70+ application that addresses content management or enterprise content management. Replace it, consolidate it. The bottom line is to create a repository that gives you the single source of truth and a quality assured content. To do so, you have to have a data model that governs the underlying repository to be able to describe the content across the business line, the upstream business line. And this data model will ensure the quality and the security and the accessibility of the content. Having said this, to replace the existing unstructured data management system incrementally, we need to do it in phases. We cannot jump the gun and do it in a big bang fashion. So how did we implement EPUR? First, once we had the vision approved by management and we had a okay to go ahead and implement EPUR, a team of SMEs from both the business and IT were formulated to study the existing application and the business needs from the users. A list of 238 functional requirements, over 19 functional areas has been created, and this was the input for the other analysis that we subcontracted to a third-party vendor, independent vendor, to study the market, tell us what is the best of breed technology that has to be adopted to implement EPUR, and to ensure what we have collected as 238 functional requirements addresses the 70 applications already in place. So the output of this analysis was the certification of the architecture of the EPUR initiative. On top, the trigger to start the first phase of EPUR. And I'll let Russell to explain about the architecture.
Yeah, so one interesting thing about the EPUR initiative is that its goal was to have a best-of-breed system. So the idea wasn't to take these existing 70 systems that they had in place and retool them underneath, but the idea was to conduct a greenfield implementation where they went back to the drawing board, they selected new vendors from the state of the technology, the best of breed, and came up with an architecture that said, this is the vision that we have for this system that we're implementing. So it wasn't based on an incremental change to try to consolidate these, but going back to the drawing board and deciding what is the best system to have, what's the best architecture, what's the best technology, and put it together that direction. The architecture that was come up with as part of this is basically starting at the data level and coming up with a single source of truth data model that combines all of the structured and unstructured information. So the key notions, when we looked at the slide before, is you have a number of different organizations that participate in the life cycle, and they have data systems that manage the organization, their ERP system. They have a structured well and field management system that's a very large database, and then they have the unstructured information. So the fundamental level is to tie these things together up at the top. Then above that, two taxonomies were built. One based around the organization so that there's a repository that follows the organizational change for Upstream. And the second is around the assets. So it follows that well life cycle all the way through from the beginning to the end, and it characterizes all of the data around fields and wells and all of the other assets that they manage. So basically, organization aspect is used to manage all of the assets that are owned by business units and managed by business units. The asset technology is intended to follow the overall life cycle and produce a comprehensive set of data about every asset that they're managing, so that if you go in and you look at a field, you find all of that information through the life cycles in that field, and same thing for the well. So basically, the processes associated with the organization taxonomy are intended to be common things that are done across the organization, like correspondence, approval, and management, or operating procedures, or how reports are produced and distributed to the assets. And so the idea behind this is to develop common solutions to common problems for these processes so that they can be deployed across the various business units and used to tie together the communications between them. And then for the asset model, everything's organized around the processes that are part of the various parts of the life cycle with the different business units and how they interplay in the assets. Then the last piece of this is the overall architecture is intended to be extensible so that basically the development work, instead of being centralized within one group, because Upstream is very large, the idea is to build a model that can be seeded from a central group and then handed out to the different business units to carry on the development in a way that allows the system to be extended in an orderly fashion that avoids the silos in the future but allows the different business units to follow their own development trajectory. So one of the key pieces of this are the integration points in the system. I'm going to talk real briefly about it. So at the lowest level, there's the foundation level where these structured data sources are brought into place. So initially, we brought in the ERP system, we brought in the well management system, tied all those together at a fundamental level. And then on top of that, the EPUR repositories were defined, and then an interface to those repositories were put in, so that in order to develop applications within the system, you don't go at the raw data sources at the bottom end, you come in through the EPUR interface system, which then handles all of the quality assurance, security methodology, and everything else that's around the data that's in the system. And then that's interfaced to a web service that allows automatic feeds that used to put things into one application to be swapped over to start loading into the EPUR repositories. And then at the top level, there's a unified UI that Waleed was talking about that's intended to be a single sign-on UI, so when someone comes into it, they basically are given access to the parts of the system they have access to and the applications and processes they have access to. And then this is extendable through a series of widgets that again can tie in other databases through this EPUR interface. So this includes things that Waleed's going to talk about, like an integration that was done with the geospatial database for GIS, and also the well modeling database for all of the well bores.
Thank you, Russ. So one of the widgets that was created over the system is the GIS Integration Widget, okay, where, for example, an engineer comes to use the system and they want to know information about a certain well, okay? By just clicking on the folder of that well, the system was able to bring him the map, okay, and it will also bring him all the information related to that well from the unstructured data repository. So the map will show all the formation around that well and the assets around that well from pipelines to plants to wells or fields or reservoirs. To a drilling engineer, this is a dream. Okay, they've been waiting for it for years, and now with just a click of a button, okay, this widget is capable of going and fetching all the related information to that asset from the organizational database or from the corporate database describing the wells, or from the unstructured repository that contains all the drilling programs and the documents related to that well, and from the geospatial database. So D2 widget is giving us the ability to integrate the Aramco GIS system to present all the information related to that well on the map. Okay, with a click of a button, you get all the information needed in one single application, if you wish. The other widget that we have done is the EPUR 3D model wellbore. Okay, allow me to just run the video to show you what I'm talking about. The D2 widget, we were able to integrate this D2 widget 3D in the D2 widget, the 3D wellbore model using iframes. And this is a living system that shows you interactively, okay, the wellbore of a well. When the well is selected, then the widget shows a 3D model of that wellbore, and the drill engineer usually they use it to know the proximity around that well, what exists, how big is that wellbore. It's an interactive tool. You can take it up, down, right, left. You see it from all aspects. Now the scope of EPUR and the roadmap planning. The first target was, or first objective was to replace the ECM infrastructure we have in Saudi Aramco and to implement the EPUR architecture, replace 70 plus existing applications and processes. We cannot do this in a big bang fashion, okay? Because it's too risky, too costly, okay? We don't know if there will be user adoption or not. So we decided to do it in phases. We implemented it in phases. So far, we have successfully completed around 12 projects on this during the 3 years. And we always keeping in mind supporting the business need and focusing on, during the implementation, on the new application, on the new business need that comes from the discussion with the users to complete the gaps. All of this need to be done without disrupting the operation. And believe me, this is a difficult job. Russell.
So as Waleed said, the focus of EPUR was to have a strong architectural design as a vision to be moving toward, but the implementation is intended to be done in an incremental series of ways that basically pays as it goes. Another piece of this is that in a company like Aramco, the business momentum is a very important thing. So you want to be able to build things that have value to the business, and you want to have the business attest to that value so that that builds the momentum as you're going through this sequence of integrations. So what Aramco did is they decided that they would choose the projects based on 4 criteria. That essentially each project had to provide tangible, measurable business benefits so that when this project was implemented, they knew who the customer was and exactly what it was they were going to be getting so that could be clearly articulated. The second is that the implementation cycles are really short, that they're no more than 3 or 4 months from project initiation to deployment to actual users. The idea is that you want to capture the benefit quickly, and you want to get these things into place so that you're able to use the benefits derived from one cycle into the next. The other reason for this is that the business is highly engaged from this, and this is a short enough cycle to where you can keep business users on your team from conception through deployment without losing their time. If you go away for 2 years to do something, you're just not going to get that much business involvement with it. The third one is that this is the strategic piece, that each project needs to use the existing framework that's been put together, refine that framework, and then prove it out as it expands into other areas. So the idea is to build on what's already been built in this phase before it. And then the last one is to take this overall roadmap and extend that roadmap for use by the next projects. So essentially you've got a balance between fast development and strategic business benefit, and then the strategic plan of moving toward this vision in a systematic way. And that part is a pretty daunting task. We're going to talk a little bit later in more detail about how projects are selected and how the strategic planning goes. But the notion is that the projects need to be very self-contained. So Waleed's going to talk a bit about how the projects are done, because one of the keys to this is containing the project into a cycle that allows us to refine and continue to move that forward as well.
Thank you. Okay, as Russell mentioned, don't forget the EPUR is a program, and in the program you have a lot of projects. We have dozens of projects already identified. So to be able to govern this project, we have a project governance model that we are following. And this project model has multiple phases, starting from initiation to kickoff, then configure, then UAT, train, and deploy. And I will be describing each one of these phases. At the project initiation, we clearly identify the pain point for the business users, and then we have like short project implementation plan, and we define the champions from the business user to engage them and make sure that the business is on board with us in every step. For the kickoff, we validate the pain point again, And we make sure that we have a success criteria to measure our success. We put the scope, and we sign off from the business user on the scope, and we outline the solution, how it's going to be and how it's going to look like. On the configuration aspect, this is a very interactive. We develop like plan for workshops, depend on the size of the project. Could be 7, 8 workshops where we meet the users, take the requirement, build the system, show it to them. It's like an agile development. Show it to them, identify the gaps, and reiterate on the process. Until we have a satisfactory result from the end user and an acceptance, we go to the UAT. On the UAT, this is the longest part of the project because it involves so many users. Sometimes it goes to up to 100 users in the process. And they come from different levels in the organization, from clerks and secretaries to senior VPs. So, you cannot engage them all the time when they are in the management or in the vice president. You cannot bring them to a training room or a meeting room all the time. So managing this and organizing this in a very organized fashion, okay, is a tedious job. So the key behind UAT is, there are 4 keys actually. One is to make sure that there is no bugs in the system before it goes to production. The second is to train the users on their role so there will be no interruption to their business operation later on when the system is deployed. Third is to have subject matter expert of that system in the remote areas. Okay, so there will be holding the know-how for the other users, and they're the one that everyone will come to them and ask them for help if they're stuck. And this way we're ensuring that there is no disruption for the day-to-day business in the remote areas, as we cannot access them easily. And last but not lastly, which is the outcome from the script developed in the UAT phase, will be the input for the training, where we put training online for those users that could not attend the UAT. They will be learning the system online, and this will minimize the number of support tickets and what have you, and will enhance the adoption from the user. And the last, which is deploying to production. When you deploy to production, we may have 2 phases, which is the migrating of the legacy content from the old system, okay, in order to put a fully populated system, and then ensuring that it's deployed with no issues to the end user and the performance is as expected. So this will describe the cycle that is iterative also for every project within the program. And now I'll let Russell describe the roadmap, how we're selecting these projects.
So Waleed laid out the project cycle, which is used every time, and I would say that the key thing about the project cycle is that it's short and contained and that we can go through it over and over again and refine it. But the important part is that it involves through every stage an increasing number of users. So as Waleed said, we get users engaged early on in the project who stay all the way through. They're part of the owners of the system, so when we go to UAT, they're helping us develop the UAT scripts, and then we bring in a large number of people for UAT. As Waleed said, sometimes 100 plus people for a UAT if it's a big system that's going to be widely dispersed. And then the UAT users become the super users that go back out to the field, and the way the user scripts look. So we use the UAT to determine how people are learning how to use the system, and we use that as those scripts as the basis for the training that comes ahead. So at each stage, we're ramping up the number of users, and this is over about a 4-month cycle max. So from conception of the project, where you have just a couple of user champions, up to when you've deployed, you've now got several hundred people involved in the course of about 3 months to go all the way into production. So choosing these projects is a big portion of this, because obviously it's not that easy to determine what are going to be the most strategic projects to do that are the easiest ones to do. So the methodology that's being used is a fairly systematic methodology. It's intended to do three things. The first is to go through and identify which projects are the best candidates to do that are going to further the strategic goals and also the business goals as well. The second is to use that information in a way that it can be carried to senior management to explain why these are the projects that should be in the budget and what the benefits are and how those are going to be measured when the project is finished. Then the third use of this is after the project's complete, it's just gone back to evaluate the process itself. Were these the right initiatives to pick? Were the assumptions made? Are the benefits being used? And then that's used as the input into the next cycle that goes on. So the cycle works fairly much like this. So Waleed talked about the requirements gathering and the survey that was done on the business. This was used to produce a universe of changes, pain points, and actions to eliminate or to alleviate those things, so that you basically have a population of items. And then with that items, you basically build this into a strategic model that's fairly simple, that for each item that's in it, you look at what are the things that need to be done before you can do this item. And the second one is, how many things does this item, is it a prerequisite to or positively influence? And the definition of a strategic item is the easiest thing to do, fewest prerequisites, and the biggest influence on other things. And so this ties into business benefit and allows projects to be selected that say, out of all of this population of things, these are what needs to be done first because they're the easiest to do and they have the biggest influence on the other things that need to be done. Those are gathered up into projects. Those are sized in order to make them fit within the time constraints. And then when that goes to the business, it goes with very specific business benefits that they're going to get. So you don't go and say, here's a whole new system. We look at, here are the three things that you get to do that you can't do today. And then make sure that the trade-offs are well understood between what the downside of changes are, because there's effort involved, and the value of these three things. And the things that we focused on the most are essentially quality and completeness, essentially what Martin brought up before, that what happens in a lot of these systems, particularly when you have siloed systems, there's significant quality and completeness problems, that you don't have all the data that you need, or you don't have the data in the right place. And so we've hammered those very hard as we go through and do the benefits. So basically, we get the project organized, we pick something that we know is containable, and then we basically tie clear measurable results to what those are, so that when we measure how the project went and we discuss the results of the project with the business, we aren't discussing whether this is slow or whether this doesn't. We're discussing, can you now find things faster? If you have to find a document or a well-completion document, is it always there? And so those are the kind of things we want to measure the system on, as opposed to the minutia of the technical details. Those are important, but the bigger thing is, what is it they can do today that they couldn't do before, and what's the benefits associated with those? So then basically after each project cycle, then we go through and we look at the strategic model. We take the items off the list that have been completed. We put items into the list that are new, that have come up in the interim when the last one was done, and then the process starts again. It gives us a new set of priorities that says, this is the most strategic things to do, that goes in to look at the next project cycle. So then each year when we go into senior management to talk about it, we can lay out the model from last year and say, this was what we said last year, these were the benefits, these are the measures of the benefits, this is what the situation looks like going forward. And so basically, this is just like with the project cycle, it's another cycle for strategic roadmap planning that doesn't say, here's our 5-year suite of projects. It's saying, this is where we're going, all the things that we need to do, and circumstantially looking at the feedback of what's been done to choose the next series of projects. So that's the theory behind what EPUR's been doing. Waleed's going to talk about how this is played out in practice.
Okay, the status and timeline for EPUR so far is, in 2013 we started EPUR, It was approved, analyzed. And in 2014, we started the implementation of the first phase, where we have built the asset and the organization model. And then on top of that, we have built two applications, which is the correspondence system and the EOL file. EOL file is the one that describes all the assets within the upstream business. From there, we deployed it in the petroleum engineering, drilling, and producing. In September 15, we implemented phase 2, where we extended the assets and organization models to cover exploration. And we deployed the correspondence system drilling and to Aramco Research Center. On top of the model that was extended, we built the exploration application for interpreter support and the GITSD for technical documentation distribution. In 16, we kicked off the first phase 3, where we have extended the capability of the system to cover business process management. And on top of that, we have built two systems, which is the drilling operation manuals and the upstream professional development courses. As you see, this incrementally adding functions based on the requirement that we have gathered at the first beginning. So far, we have implemented around 12 successful projects, and we covered around 65% of the capability that we have gathered earlier. All of this done in 2 years without disrupting the business and with a high successful rate and adoption rate. So in conclusion, Saudi Aramco has focused on a dual plan of strategically building the new technical foundations, engaging and making partners of the business users. The keys are technology selection and architectural trajectory, making partners and vendors and the business, managing risk through the project selection and planning process. Bottom line, we have now systems that is used by 1,250 users, and the ratio is going up because we are receiving requests to join the system incrementally. We have happy users and successful projects. Thank you for listening.